Usually you get a few changes that go through a patch without making it into the patch notes. Sometimes they're just forgotten off the end of the list, or they're so small that they're not really worth mentioning. But with update 6.2, DICE missed a lot of things out with Battlefield 5. So much so that it kind of makes me wonder whether they didn't want people to know about them. And most of them are to do with vehicles and how effective they are. And now that we've got all of the details, thanks to Azura, who drew up some diagrams to show the changes. A big shout out to Azura, by the way, for letting me use that information in this video today. Make sure you check out his channel, it's linked below in the description. I can now give you more information about what has changed. You might have noticed, you might not have noticed, but at least after this video, you'll have all the information you need. We're going to start off with tanks first of all, because there are a lot more changes here than there are for the planes, and the first change is Howitzers are now quote-unquote fixed. After update 5.2 back in December, which I'm now just going to call the worst patch of all time because clearly it didn't do what it was supposed to do, DICE broke the Howitzers and they applied an incorrect damage curve to them. The one-hit kill radius of the Howitzers was made smaller than the regular cannons on most of the other tanks, which made them not really worth using. Now though, they've been brought back into line and they've returned to their previous spot in the balance. This diagram here shows the old one-hit kill blast radius in red, that's the update 5.2 value, and then the new one in green, the update 6.2 value. And so that's a boost from 2.325 to 3.1 meters. This value is consistent across all tanks in the game that have a howitzer option apart from the American LVT. That one's got a separate value of 2.6 meters. So this now means that the howitzer has a much larger area of effect than it did previously, and that should in turn mean more kills if you're good with your aim over longer distances. Moving on from howitzers to the default HE shells. 5 tanks have had their blast radius increased here, giving drivers a bit more power than they had before update 6.2. The blast radius for the default HE shells on the Panzer 38T, the Staghound, without the Little John adapter, the Sherman and the Chiha have increased from 1.6 to 2 meters. This means that if players aren't wanting to move away from the default cannon option, or perhaps they're just a new player and they're getting into using vehicles, they now have a bit more leniency, and of course that's important for new players. Most more experienced players will be using their tank specialization trees to build something to their playstyle, but if you're just someone who hops into tanks every now and again, this will also be quite helpful if you're going to take out some infantry targets. It is worth noting, however, that all the HE shells have had their drop increased on them, and that means that sniping with your tank will now be a bit more difficult, and that might result in less drivers just parking up on some elevated terrain and then firing shells at long range. Hopefully that means more tanks just getting stuck into the action around objectives. Next on the list of completely hidden changes, we're going to talk about the Chiha tank specifically. This got a significant anti-tank buff in update 6.2, and it focuses around the Type 5 cannon you can equip. That's the biggest cannon you can get for the Chiha. Now, based on the files alone, this cannon has gotten a 66% increase in impact damage, which is just insane when you think about it. There are other factors that you have to consider, of course, so that 66% value is not likely something you're going to see in-game because you have to think about blast damage on top of that. But based on estimates by Azura, it could well be anywhere from the mid-40s to a 60% increase in damage when using the Type 5 cannon. So overall, it is a massive buff here. This change means that the Type 5 is now identical to the Sherman's Heat T-shell, giving both factions harder hitting anti-tank options. So even though this buff does look amazing for the Chiha tank, it's more of an alignment of options for the two different factions. There are still some differentiating factors, however. The Chiha with the Type 5, that gets more shells than the equivalent Sherman, but you can't switch to HE shells with the Type 5. So that makes your tank less powerful in situations other than scouting out other tanks to kill. Also, the Type 5 got a one-hit kill blast radius reduction in update 6.2 from 1.6 to 1.2 meters. That balances out the increase in impact damage. And then onto another tank that got a massive buff, the Churchill Gun Carrier. Its default HE shell had its one-hit kill blast radius increased from 2 to 2.4 meters, which now matches most of the other HE cannons in the game, but at the same time, it kept its fast shell velocity of 590 meters per second, which is better than any other tank with a HE option. And this means for longer range engagements, you're not going to have to lead your targets as much as you would with other tanks. The AP shell for the gun carrier, that got a massive buff of around 55% in damage against other tanks. That now makes it capable of one-shot killing light and medium tanks with a well-placed shot to the rear of those tanks. So that puts it on par with the Tiger tank heat shell, except that the gun carrier has double the velocity of the Tiger, and that makes it a much better option than what it was before. When you take a look at this graph of changes to impact damage for the various different shells, you do get a proper sense of the kind of direction that DICE was pushing tank gameplay with Update 6.2. The direction was more damage. This should be translating into faster overall tank gameplay, where each shot should be much more devastating if it lands on target. Hitting the weaker spots on tanks is now even more important than ever because of this increased damage, and it's likely going to cut down significantly on the amount of time that it takes to deal with an enemy tank that might be bothering you. So overall, Update 6.2 has been massive for tanks. It's been a big buff all round, basically. Okay, so now that's tanks out of the way, let's talk about planes in the sky. We don't have as many changes here, but some of them are quite important, so I'll list them out for you now. The AG-6M2's light machine gun, that got a small nerf with Update 6.2. The starting damage drop-off is now a little bit closer. It starts at 50 meters and finishes at 130 meters. I believe before the patch it started at 70 and then finished at 150, so things have come in just slightly. The 8x rockets on all of the different planes have had their rates of fire increased by 25% and velocity by 100%, which is a fairly significant buff. The 2x 500-pound bombs, they've had a longer delay implemented in between drops, and that's going to make it a little bit harder to take out a target on the ground in one strafe, so that's a nerf. The Mosquito 6-pounder blast radius, that's been increased by 50%, and apparently that's going to make it easier to deal full damage to enemy planes, at least easier than what it was before. I wouldn't know. I don't fly planes. Next, a potential error from DICE here. I'm not surprised. The RP3 rockets on the Spitfire and the Mosquito have been massively buffed and appear to have been given the values of the land-based RP3 rockets on the Staghound by mistake. This means that at the moment, in one strafe, you can take out tanks completely without any problem whatsoever. So, hopefully DICE fixes that one in their next update. And then lastly, DICE has buffed the AA cannons in Update 6.2, making it somewhat easier to take down planes if they're flying right at the AA cannon. Now, this is something that they said that would have been applied in a previous update, and I think I remember it maybe a couple of months ago. I'm not 100% sure, but I've definitely heard of it before for Battlefield 5, but the experience that I've been having is just me not being able to kill those planes that fly right at me because they start their drop so high in the sky that I can't really be accurate with the AA gun. So if they've buffed AA guns against planes that are flying right at the AA gun, hopefully that should now mean that you kill planes a bit more effectively. So there you have it then, a bunch of vehicle changes that for one reason or another didn't make it into the Battlefield 5 patch notes, but what's concerning is how big these changes were and that they didn't make it into the patch notes. I understand when smaller things don't get added in or maybe a couple of important things are missed off, but not a gigantic chunk of vehicle gameplay changes that just didn't get added to the patch notes. That's somewhat concerning. But at least now you have the info if you didn't already have it. Thanks very much again to Azura for letting me use his information and screenshots in this video. Please go and subscribe to his channel. It's linked below the like button in the description. he was really kind enough to let me use this stuff. He didn't have to, but he let me do it, so that's really nice of him. And again, thanks to you guys for watching as well. And I'll catch you in the next one.